Hey everybody, I wanted to do a video series and this is video number 1 and I'm going to try to do these weekly, and I know I always say that and I just get too busy with family and work, but I'm going to really do my best. What this series is going to be about is basically how to fly radio control aircraft, and this is fixed wing aircraft, not helicopters, not quads, strictly fixed wing aircraft. The reason I'm making this video is a lot of my fans have always heard me, do posts, either on Facebook or wherever, and they're like, why don't you take all your experience of flying model airplanes and share it with the world? So I decided I'm going to do a video series. This one's about why we crash, okay? And a little bit of background if you don't know me. I've been around forever doing model airplanes. Giant scale is where my passion is, where I build some planes with 18 to 20 foot wingspans, to the point that my friends made so much fun of me to say build a real airplane. I decided to build a real airplane. So right now these are my ribs for my real airplane. It's called an air bike. It's an ultralight, but I've only got 4 ribs left to do before rephrase that. I have 4 ribs left to frame before I have to flip them over and do gussets on the rest. So I still have a couple of weeks to finish the ribs, but I'm going to jump into the model airplane stuff. So if you're brand new to flying model airplanes, I would beg you to go online and really understand the principles of what make an airplane fly. Because one thing about model aircraft is you don't get much ground school. When you become a real pilot, I shouldn't say real pilot, when you become a private pilot, because we're all pilots and we're flying model aircraft, I think any airplane is a real airplane if it flies. But when you learn to fly as a private pilot, you have so many hours of ground school and so many hours of flying in the airplane, okay? And model aircraft people normally don't get any ground school. So what I want to dive into is I've got 3 airplanes here, and I'm going to use them as kind of examples. But the thing to remember about aircraft is the wings are there for the lift. You have the mass of the airplane, which creates a wing load. The lighter the wing load, usually the easier the plane is to fly. And then you have thrust, which is power. Most model airplanes are grossly overpowered to full-scale airplanes. Okay, the rule of thumb for many people is, do you have 25% of your thrust should be the weight of your airplane. There's model aircraft that are like fighter jets. They have 3 times the thrust to their weight. 3D planes, for an example. So then you need to think about the drag on the airplane. What kind of drag do you have in the airplane? And I'm going to do a video series in the future on how to land perfect virtually every time. And I'll explain then why drag is really important. But we're talking about why do we crash. So basically crashes happen most of the time with landing. But I'm not going to start there. Let's say takeoff crashes. Takeoff crashes happen because you either have an engine failure or you shove the throttle open and you've just done something stupid. Okay, that's about 10% of the crashes. Landing crashes are like 70 to 80% of what's going wrong with your airplane. It's in the landing, you've done something wrong. You have engine failures, and then you have the show-offs. And what I joke about is if you're flying a knife edge down the runway 3 inches off the ground and you hit the runway and crash, that is your fault, okay? But let's break down for a minute the airplanes. So if you're flying a foamy, I think that's awesome because it's an airplane. You're learning the sticks, you're learning how everything works. I would ask that you learn in a simulator a little bit how to fly an airplane. I would also ask that if you're an RC car person, you've already gotten the left and rights figured out, so that's a huge advantage to you. But you got the foamies, you have trainers, you got sports planes, you got warbirds, you got turbines, you got EDFs, you got all these airplanes, and all of them fly a little bit different. So one thing I want to talk about briefly is when you're in a landing pattern, you have a couple of things going on with your airplane. You have to slow it down to land it. Most the time when you're learning to fly full scale, it's hammered into your head that your attitude is your airspeed and that your power is your altitude. And I'll give you an example. If you trim an airplane out to fly perfectly level at 3rd throttle and then nail it to full throttle, it will climb. Power is altitude. If you're flying on a third throttle and you pull it to idle, the plane's going to sink and descend. Okay? Power is your altitude. Your attitude is your airspeed. So if you're flying along and you pull that nose up without adding any power, your plane, it will balloon up a little bit, but ultimately it's going to slow down and start to descend. If you're flying along the third throttle and you put your nose down, your plane's going to start picking up a lot of airspeed. Okay? So pitch is airspeed. Power is your altitude. It's really important to learn this if you want to understand how to really ace the landings. Okay? And that's where most of the crashes occur. So I'm going to give you an example of, actually, I'm going to digress just for a minute. Let's back up for a second. If I go into flying a giant scale airplane, I have logbooks for them. And I go to the airfield, and every time I fly, I write down how long my flight was, and I do write down, anything eventful. And if I had a good landing, I write down great landing. But in the back of my logbook, I write down every time I see a crash. And over 70% of these crashes happen on landing. So what happens is, you've got an airplane that wants to fly as long as you've got the power up. But when you go to slow down to land, you start doing some bizarre things in an airplane that you don't consciously realize you're doing. And one of them is, where are your sticks? Now, we've already talked about if you raise the pitch of the airplane, it will slow down. So if you're entering the downwind to land and you go into your turn, you naturally pull back on that stick to hold the altitude in the turn. When you're pulling back on that stick, you are increasing your angle of attack and you are slowing the airplane down. In full-scale airplanes, when I'm turning, like a Cherokee, you always bump a little bit power up when you're in a turn because you're pulling back on the stick. So you need to kind of subconsciously teach yourself, anytime you pull back on your stick, you need to add power. I tell you, that's going to be absolutely a lifesaver for your airplane, especially when you get into higher wing loads. So the way I land is downwind, base, and then final. Most crashes I've recorded is turning base to final. And what it is the person is normally starting to overshoot the runway, and then they really start to crank back on that elevator, and they don't realize they're getting their angle of attack really high, and the plane spins in, and they're like, oh my God, my radio, I lost radio control. No, you didn't. You stalled your airplane. The reason it feels like you lost your radio is because when the plane's stalling, your ailerons are basically useless. So you're moving your ailerons, nothing's happening. You're like, my radio's not working. Most RC pilots really suck at rudder for flying the airplane traditionally. Now, you might be great at rudder doing knife edge. You might be great at doing rudder flying, Harriers or whatever, 3D. But most RC pilots really stink with using rudder to understand how to keep the wings level or how to keep the airplane, if it's starting to stall, on heading or saving the airplane. You can do that slow flying, but most RC pilots don't slow fly. So let's talk about how that entire landing sequence can be affected by different type of airplanes. If you've got a foamy that has an extremely really light wing load, the chances are when you start pulling up the angle of attack, you won't notice that much if the plane's getting ready to stall. And if it's a really light airplane, you stall it and you crash it into the weeds. Most of the time you hot glue it back together and you fly it again. But let's say you start to get into a complex airplane, and I'm just going to use this Viking and call it a P-51 Mustang. P-51 Mustangs are inherently heavy because people want to put paint on them, they want to put rivets on them, they want to put all the detail on it, and they end up with a lead sled. So again, full-scale aircraft, if I'm flying the downwind and I'm turning to base and I forget to add power and I pull back on the stick, I will actually hear my stall horn a little bit. It'll start beeping at me. It means that I'm approaching a stall. Bump up a little bit of power, drop the nose, and I go right through the turn. Model aircraft don't have stall horns. And the ones that have airspeed indicators, if it's a GPS one, they're not very accurate. And if you got the pitot tube, it will drive you nuts listening to it in your ear going 55, 54, 55, 53. It will drive you nuts because I have telemetry on my planes. And I normally turn the airspeed to tell me only every 10 seconds. That doesn't help in a landing though. So, if you're flying a plane that has a higher wing load, and it has It's not very draggy. I mean, it's an airplane that is pretty slippery through the air. A lot of people will go all the way down the runway and can't land it because they're coming too fast. So what do? They then go too slow. So what I would beg you to do with high performance airplanes is get up and do some slow flying. Drop the landing gear, drop the flaps, do it 3 or 4 mistakes high, and let the plane fall off and stall. If it starts to drop a wing, use a little bit of opposite rudder. See if you can learn to keep the wings wobbling with just rudder. Stay off the ailerons. Because one thing about the aileron is when you drop an aileron, that angle of attack's going up. So if you're in a turn and you already got the angle of attack of the wing almost at a stall, and you drop that aileron can cause that high wing to stall before the low wing. Because the low wing is actually creating a negative or less angle of attack, and it wants to keep flying. Okay? So flying model aircraft sounds extremely complicated with everything I'm telling you, okay? And knock on wood, but I've gone 15 years without crashing an airplane. Okay? Even if, I'm trying to think if I crashed one that was me being stupid. But on landings, I have not crashed an airplane in so long because I, in my mind, already have locked out everything I'm going to do in that landing. I've flown the airplane enough to know where my stick should be in the downwind. I've flown that airplane enough to know when I'm in base where my stick should be in base. A really high performance airplane, you want to get rid of most of your airspeed once your wings are level and you're flying at the runway. So slow the plane down in downwind, make sure you hold a little bit of power through your turns, okay? If you notice the plane does any wobbling at all, just firewall it and fly out of it and come back around. Okay, there's no reason unless your engine dies that you have to land. If your plane's not on fire and your engine's not dead, you don't have to land. Now, always have like 4 minutes of extra gas when you have the alarm go off in your radio. So if you're flying electric, have 4 minutes reserve. If you're flying gas or glow, have 4 minutes of reserve. And the way I normally do that is I run the engine at 3/4 power if it's a gas or glow, which I haven't had in 20 years, and just let it run the whole fuel tank and time it. And then I'd set my timer for 4 minutes less of that. Chances are in the air I'm going to be at idle a lot more and I won't use anywhere near all that gas. But when you think of turning downwind to base to final, let's say you've got it lined up on final, you don't want to be so far out that you can't see your airplane. But that is where I will then almost chop the power all the way to idle, put my nose down so I can see my horizontal stabilizer, depending on the type of airplane, above my wing. If I can see that horizontal stabilizer above the wing on most airplanes, I know I have my nose down. Okay? So the thing is that I will pull the power back, get a little bit nose down attitude, and see how much the plane starts sinking. If I notice the plane is really coming down, I'll start adding power. Do not pull the nose up. You pull that nose up and you're dropping your airspeed. Add power. If you watch any of the videos on YouTube of aircraft carrier pilots landing, you hear that guy yelling, power, power, you're high, power. He never says nose up or nose down. Power is your altitude. So once you're lined up on final, if you're sinking, don't pull that nose up. Add power. If you know you're too fast and you're just blistering in, pull it to idle. You know, I would say raise the nose to slow it down, but a lot of time on model airplanes, you'll balloon up a little bit and then everybody freaks out and thinks, oh gosh, it's going too high, and then they want to chop their power even farther, which is the worst thing you can do. So on model aircraft, it's very hard to use your attitude for airspeed on that final approach landing. So what I do is I'll pull it almost down to idle, or I'll fly the airplane enough to know that 3 clicks of throttle is what I want to be on final. Another thing I would beg you to do is once you've got 20 or 30 flights on the airplane and you're really starting to feel good with it, take a couple of paper plates, face them down on your runway, and try to land every time at those paper plates. It will end up teaching you the most proficient pilot you can be. And when you go to other clubs, all you got to do is pick a point, mentally on the field, and you'll land there every time. One thing you never want to do is make the airplane land. If you're ever pushing forward stick to land an airplane, you could get into a pilot-induced oscillation, and that's where you bounce once, bounce two. Now you're in the air stalling. you're scared to give it full throttle because you think it's going to torque, roll, and crash, and you normally tear up your airplane. You should always be landing in a flare. So I'm going to try to wrap this up as quick as I can now and talk about some basic things that you need to know about your airplane you're flying, though, to prevent landing crashes. And that is your trims, your exponentials, your CG, and make sure the incidences are right on the airplane. I don't know how many planes I've test flown for people, because back in the day, I would test fly everybody's airplane. I have probably test flown over 200 planes, okay? The biggest thing that I have found out is people built the airplane basically perfectly straight, but they had their travels wrong. And what I mean is their trim. So I had an airplane one time, it was called a Aeromaster biplane, I think it was called. Had a Super Tiger something in it, like a 75 or 60, no, it wasn't a KMB 65. Maybe it was a KMB 65, showing my age, that's 30 years ago. But I went over the airplane like a fine-tooth comb. All the travels were the right direction. Left was left, right was right, up was up, up was down, down was down. And I took the plane up and immediately pitched up on me really hard. And I got into a little bit of a pilot-induced oscillation because I had massive travel on this airplane. This person set it up to do aerobatics, and on the test flight, I should have had the exponentials on, so I had a lot less travel. So everybody behind me is yelling, it's tail heavy, oh my gosh, it's gonna crash. And visually, it looked to everybody like it was tail heavy, but it was not, it was nose heavy. What was going on there was he had so much up elevator trim in it that I didn't notice that every time I would go forward on a stick, I was overcompensating because the travels were too far. Once I got the plane trimmed out up there, I had a friend always standing on my right and said, give me a bunch of down elevator trim. And I'm flying the airplane, he's trimming it down, I said, give me 2 more clicks, he's giving me down. All of a sudden I'm flying level, I take my thumbs off, the plane is tracking straight as an arrow. I did a couple of loops, a couple of rolls, and I said, this plane is not tail heavy, guys. I think it's a little nose heavy. But because it wasn't trimmed right on the ground, everybody instantly thought. I tested a Byron Pitts where the top wing incidence was at 5.5 degrees, and I think it was supposed to be 2. That plane went wonky on me, and I swear it flew like, I thought for sure it was tail heavy, but I checked the CG, it was right. It wasn't until we got on the ground and I started looking at the airplane and noticed that the wing struts had a weird shape cut to them because I had built several of the Byron Pitts. I said, why is your, and he goes, well, it was to get the wing on there straight. I go, what are you talking about? He had 5.5 degrees positive incidence on the top of the wing. The top wing was only supposed to be like 1.5 degrees. Well, of course that's going to make the plane track crazy. So make sure your incidences are right, your CG's right, your travel throws are right. There's so much on your airplane you got to make sure is right so that you don't get up in the air and have all these problems with it, and then when you go to land it, you can't slow it down without stalling or crashing it. So that's pretty much it, everybody. I'm going to do these video series, try to do them every week. The next one is going to be on basically taking off because I got horror stories about watching seasoned pilots. People spend 5 years building a P-51, destroy it on takeoff because of some fundamentals they didn't follow. So this one is on why we crash. And most of the crashes I see, oh, now I do have my B-1 bomber here. If you're flying an EDF, you are probably already experienced from flying a bunch of different airplanes to sequence into flying higher performance, fast airplanes. Okay, one of the greatest things about this hobby is, especially today, is you can start with a simulator, you can then go to a foamy, you can then go to like a sport plane, then you can go to a warbird, then you could possibly go to an EDF or a turbine, but you need to go through that sequence of progression and learning. I don't know how many times people would show up with a beautiful Corsair, and I was like, is this your first airplane? Well, of course not. I've been flying a Cub for 2 years. Mustangs fly a lot different than the Cub, people. So I'm just trying to share some of my knowledge. I'm going to knock on wood again because I'm sure I'm going to go out and crash now. But keep the emails and questions coming to me. I love to help you all out. You know, I tried to keep in my logbook how many takeoff and landings I had. And last year in 2019, I had 615 takeoff and landings in my giant scale model aircrafts. Now that sounds like a lot, but that was me only getting out and flying like 40 times last year. Yeah, like 40 times or 30 times. And most of the time I'll fly 5 times, you know, maybe 8 times each day I'm out flying. So it adds up really quick. But when you're landing an airplane is the most dangerous time because you have to get it slow enough to land, but you don't want to get it too slow. So I hope all this made sense, everybody. This video is a little bit rough, so I apologize. I'm going to try to figure out how to get these formats right, and I'll see you next time. Rock on, everybody, and have an awesome day.